The morning the cane knives gleamed like small moons along the ditch, Eulalie Baptiste rose before the rooster and pressed her palm to the kitchen hearth to judge the night's last heat. She listened for the river the way other people listened for their own blood, low, persistent, a voice in the spine of the land. She tied her hair in a kerchief, checked the sleeping breath of her daughter on the pallet, and stepped into the indigo dark where smoke from last night's ash pit drew thin blue threads to the rafters. The plantation was already awake, though it pretended not to be. Mules stamped, a chain clinked, someone coughed in the cloth to keep from waking grief. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. She took the kettle down, the iron warm as a quiet animal, and set it on the relit flame. The kitchen had the kind of darkness that seemed to have weight in it, and her hands knew the stations by memory. Salt barrel, lard crock, sack of cornmeal tucked beneath the table leg, mortar with its pestle laid across like a sleeping bone. She measured without looking, made a batter that promised to rise if spoken to kindly, and when the door eased open and Juniet peered in, Eulalie tilted her chin toward the red coals and said, "Mornin', bird." The girl slipped on her shoes without laces and came to stand where the hearth threw warmth across her calves. The hem of her dress singed in a place she kept worrying with her fingers. The calendar of labor had no letters for them. It lived in bodies and weather, in the tempo of cicadas and the thinness of the moon. But on this piece of land along Bayou Teche, there was a new mark to attend to. The Harvest Festival, promised in loud words by Mr. Saul Armitage, whose hat brim always looked freshly murdered, like it had never met rain or remorse. Saul had invited his neighbors for a night of laughing with their mouths full, of praising Providence for cane yields, and counting the losses that somehow never included their own. Eulalie learned of it first from the china that arrived in crates wrapped in newsprint, thin pages she smoothed and flattened and carried to the hearth as if they were church leaves. She had learned herself the shapes of letters by candle fat and stubbornness, by ear and echo, tracing loops on ash with a twig after everyone slept. Words were a secret she kept folded under her tongue like a peppermint she refused to swallow. Junia watched her mother read with her eyes and not her lips, and always wanted to ask about the trick, but Eulalie would only say, "Some things you keep for winter." She was a woman of the kitchen and the yard, the river path and the wash bench, and what she understood best were things that didn't brag they were clever. Meal, fire, water. The way sour could be coaxed into sweet if you had a cool corner and a patience taller than a man. She knew stretches of the bayou where the water tasted like old pennies and where it sang high and clean against the cypress knees. She knew plants by their silences and their perfumes, by which ones the children made crowns from and which ones the goats refused. That morning, she sent Junia with a small basket to fetch eggs from the lean-to coop and to carry back whatever news the air wanted to give. The girl returned with 3 warm shells and the sound of 2 wagons on the road from Opelousas, neighbors arriving early to brag about late harvests. Eulalie cracked the eggs into the bowl one by one, catching the shells in her palm to count the halves as if they were a prayer bead. "There will be pies until the night forgets its stars," she told Junia, "and men who will want to taste their power in every bite. You keep to me tonight. You keep to my shadow." Junia nodded, but the girl's gaze had a reach to it already, a way of noticing the world that made it hard for Eulalie to remember she'd once been that brave. Junia could look at a fence post and see the thread that tied it to the moon. She could look at a white woman's glove and see every hand that had stitched it. Eulalie had tried to teach her daughter how to be small in dangerous rooms, yet some mornings the child woke large, her questions big as fences. By afternoon, the air grew sugary with boiling cane, and every fly for 10 miles argued about it with its wings. Eulalie stirred a pot that could have held 3 babies and skimmed with the practiced flicks that saved syrup from bitterness. She moved among ovens with the step of a dance she'd never been taught, but always knew, and the women working beside her watched for her nods the way sailors watch for changes in current. She didn't call herself a leader, didn't dare, But when a storm wants to organize itself, it looks for the tree that won't bend. From the doorway, Overseer Pike leaned and watched like a man who had all the time in the world and none of it for mercy. He told Eulalie once that her biscuits were the only decent Yankee thing to cross the Mason-Dixon. He said it like a compliment and a threat wrapped in the same napkin. Today, he said nothing. He just measured the room with his eyes and chewed a stem until the taste turned mean. Eulalie felt his attention like grit in her mouth and let it pass. There were other hands to watch, other clocks to set. By evening, lanterns ringed the big house like a necklace around an unrepentant throat. The neighbors came smiling, pink from drink before they lifted their glasses, their women in gowns that moved like expensive water. Saul Armitage welcomed them from the veranda, his voice broad, his words shaped to be heard by people who already agreed with him. "To sweet Cain," he said, "and to the labor Providence provides." The men laughed in the place where laughter was expected. Some nodded to the moon like it had been hired for the event and done a satisfactory job. Eulalie sent platters out like a sequence of soft spells. She saw the lines of the party as if they'd been drawn in chalk. The pockets of men who would decide the year without touching a hoe. The wives who would decide nothing out loud and everything in the morning. The children who were kept inside to learn manners in fear. She saw the spaces in between where a person could pass unseen. She counted the decanters and their shadows. She counted the servants borrowed from neighboring places and mouthed their names so she could find them later. She counted her breath when it threatened to go shallow.
Junia stood at the scullery door with a tray of small glasses, waiting for her mother's eye. When Eulalie lifted 2 fingers, the girl moved, learning the geometry of bodies, of distance, of when to turn and when to wait. They worked in a language made of the smallest gestures, the lift of a chin, the tilt of a bowl, the set of a shoulder. And beneath that language, Eulalie kept another, older one she'd learned from the river, the patience of slow water, the speed it could gather when the land angled right. Eulalie had not planned to become the kind of woman whose thoughts ran down dangerous channels. Plans like that were for people who could afford to get caught. But there are nights when the future sits down in a room uninvited and asks if you have a chair for it. There are days when cruelty arrives wearing Sunday clothes and asks to be served first. There are mothers whose daughters have the kind of eyes that make you find your courage even when you'd rather hide it behind the flour barrel. The choice took shape a week ago. A small, hard kernel lodged under Eulalie's ribs. Pike had followed Junia to the smokehouse to fetch salt. He'd been drunk on cane whiskey and a kind of power that made his hands wander. Junia had run back blotched with fear and a scrape like a cruel signature on her wrist. Eulalie had washed the wound with cool water and sang a song even she barely remembered, one her own mother might have used to tell the night to mind its manners. She said nothing to the man. She said nothing to anyone. She let the kernel sit where it could keep time. She went to the river at dawn the next morning and watched the mist right itself across the surface. She thought of saints and sinners and men who wanted to be both. She thought of recipes that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. The way a pinch of something could quiet another taste without announcing itself. She thought of the festival to come and what it meant to make a room for people who considered your body part of their pantry. She did not name the plant she watched on the bank. She did not speak its secret. She only gave the river a nod that meant, "I hear you, old friend." She only promised herself that if the world would not return Junia's safety, it would at least learn to fear the quiet hands that had been feeding it. The tangle in her chest loosened in the days that followed. Not because she had forgiven anything, but because a person can move once she has told herself the truth. In the kitchen, she redirected tasks like current. She traded bowls with the skill of a card sharp. She made sure certain vessels passed through her hands and no one else's. She asked to polish the silver and counted the flaws in each spoon. She sent boys with messages to women whose eyes had learned to meet hers and hold, not dart away. She did not tell them what the holding meant. She did not have to. Junia watched, and Eulalie let her watch. She could not smuggle her child out of a lifetime while everyone stared, but she could smuggle knowledge into the girl's bones, one gesture at a time. "If you ever need to be invisible," she said as they scrubbed pots together in the oily dark, "carry something heavy and look like you belong." Unia nodded. "If you ever need to be seen," Eulalie added, "stand in the doorway and don't blink." On the morning of the festival, Eulalie sent a borrowed boy named Marcus to fetch rosemary from the kitchen garden and to count the chickens that could be plucked without the mistress noticing the arithmetic. He delivered it beneath a basket of biscuits to a woman named May from the Arnaud place, a woman with forearms like proofs and a soft voice. The paper carried only a drawing, 7 circles that might have been plates or moons, with a small cross through the last of them. Maeve looked at the drawing once and slid it under her waistband. She hummed something low and old as she worked, and the hum found its way into the kitchen like a wind through a cracked window, unnoticed by the men who took the room for theirs. Eulalie had not planned to become the kind of woman whose thoughts ran down dangerous channels. Plans like that were for people who could afford to get caught. But there are nights when the future sits down in a room uninvited and asks if you have a chair for it. There are days when cruelty arrives wearing Sunday clothes and asks to be served first. There are mothers whose daughters have the kind of eyes that make you find your courage even when you'd rather hide it behind the flour barrel. As the sun slid toward the sugar of late day, the yard filled with the early fever of celebration. Fiddles tuned. A boy tested a drum with a wrist so careful you knew it had been taught to be rough and learned softness on its own. Eulalie stood in the kitchen, the heat a second spine at her back, and arranged small pastries on a tray like stars in a sky she wanted to govern. She placed them in patterns only her hands understood, and then shifted them again, until the tray told the story she needed it to tell. That abundance could have edges. She had watched these men for years, learned their habits like weather. She knew who ate first and fastest, who liked to talk with his mouth full, who set his glass down with a slap that said the table had to respect him. She knew which one rinsed his fingers in the finger bowl as if cleansing himself of consequence. She knew Saul kept 3 favorites by him at all times: a glass of good bourbon, a cut of meat with more fat than any physician would advise, and a man who agreed with him when he needed a mirror. She knew Overseer Pike didn't much care for pie, but would eat whatever was put in front of him if it let him keep a seat by the men with money. Unia came in with a face glowing from the flare of lanterns catching the sweat on her brow. "They want the cider with the cinnamon sticks, Mama," she said, "and the little cups, the pretty ones." Eulalie nodded and lifted a pitcher heavy as a baptism. "Stay close," she said, and Unia did, her shoulder brushing her mother's hip as they moved through the door and into the clamor of men congratulating themselves for the obedience of crops.
The night opened like a book read aloud by someone who loved their own voice. Eulalie's senses sharpened in self-defense. She smelled tobacco, damp cloth, perfume trying too hard, and the faint iron of the tools put down for the day, yet still warming the air like an invisible forge. She heard the creak of boards under boots that had never walked barefoot over cypress knees. She counted again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Not all masters by title. The word fit them anyway. Men who owned or oversaw, who spoke into being the rules that made bodies into ledgers. When the first course went out, Eulalie sent with it a plate to the back stoop where the older women ate standing up. She fixed a bowl for Junia that was more air than food, because a person who needs to move fast must not be heavy. She slipped a cloth-wrapped bundle into her own pocket, a weight she had measured when no one was looking, and then measured again with her eyes, asking if she could carry it without changing her gait. Music began in earnest, a tune lively enough to keep anyone from thinking. Eulalie hated it at first for how it demanded lightness from people who had none to spare. Then she let the tune do what it wanted with the room, while she did what she had to do with the edges of it. She moved from table to table with the small attention of a person arranging a funerary wreath so the dead would feel honored and the living would not suspect. Junia was a breath behind her.
2 breaths when Eulalie needed space, one hand always free to touch the back of her mother's skirt to make sure she was real. When Eulalie stopped at Saul's right, she saw the shape of a man who had never once been told he'd taken enough. He lifted a glass and put a story in it about weather and grit, about how he had pulled sugar from a land that owed him gratitude. Eulalie heard only the word our, pronounced as mine. She waited for the laughter at the end to tilt the room like a boat on a wave. In that tilt was always the space to move unseen. In that tilt, a hand could be where it had not been a second earlier, and no one would testify to it. She let the tilt take her and placed a plate down with one finger steadying its rim. She let her other hand do the secret thing it had memorized. She withdrew. The room returned. A man told a joke about Providence having a sense of humor and picked up a fork. At the neighbor's table, a Mr. Ives from St. Martin, a Mr. Beaufort whose hat had its own pride, a Mr. Kitteridge who returned each dish with a comment, Eulalie saw Maeve's hand, large and quiet, set a gravy boat a little too far to the left. Mr. Ives moved it closer without wondering why. The river has many mouths, Eulalie thought. It will find its way to the Gulf. In the corner, Pike watched Junia too closely, his eyes a kind of stain. Eulalie's body learned a new way to stand, one that gave the impression she was between the girl and the world without announcing it. Junia lifted her chin exactly as she'd been taught. She looked like a girl holding a tray, which is to say, she looked like a girl holding her own future still with her wrists. Courses tumbled forward, toasts mounted. The room loosened as if someone had cut a lace too tight around its waist. Eulalie kept counting. She counted breaths between jokes. She counted swallows. She counted how often Saul looked to Pike when the men laughed too hard, needing someone to agree that his power held even when mirth threatened to scatter it. Delicacies made their appearances. Pralines wrapped in papers wearing sugar like a veil. Little cakes treacherously light. A custard that quivered with the nerves of the woman who had made it. Eulalie had a mind to comfort that woman with a squeeze of the hand, but she had run out of hands that evening. She gave the comfort to Junia in a look instead. The girl gave it back tenfold. When the clock over the mantel confessed to being 9, Eulalie felt the night turn. There is an hour when festivity begins to resemble the siege one holds against oneself. Faces flush. Jokes lean too hard on words that shouldn't be leaned on. Eulalie felt it and knew the hour had come for choice to become consequence. She had seen this hour before and survived by becoming smaller than an aptim. Tonight, she made herself exactly the size of the room. She set one more tray before Saul and the men nearest him, the ones who did not want to wait their turn for anything, not even God. She stepped back. She lifted her eyes, which no one expected. She looked at Saul as if he were a man and not the weather. He noticed, and for a moment his face rearranged itself, trying to find an expression that fit. Junia came to her side, no tray now, empty-handed, the way you are before you fill both palms with something you will carry for the rest of your life. Eulalie could feel the girl's heartbeat the way a person feels a drum through the soles of their feet. She could smell a sweetness in the air turning towards something else, a bouquet of sugar and smoke and the penny taste that lives under both. Mr. Kitteridge raised his fork and said, "To the women who make the work of men look easy." Men laughed. Women smiled the way they do when the room expects it. Junia did not smile. She refused to be counted wrong. Eulalie reached to touch her daughter's wrist and found it steady. At the far table, Maeve's humming became a note so low it could have been the sound of the house settling. That note found Eulalie's ribs and set them vibrating. She had not asked the woman from Arnall to help her with anything, had only drawn circles on a page and hoped that someone would know what the moon meant. The note told her that someone did. The first sign was nothing anyone else would have called a sign. Mr. Beaufort pressed 2 fingers to his temple like the day had been heavy and refused to sit properly on his neck. He lifted his water with a hand that wanted to shake and told it not to. The second sign was Mr. Ives pushing his plate away too precisely, like it had asked an impertinent question. The third sign was Saul laughing a little too loud. Across the room, Pike leaned forward, the stem of his glass between his teeth, watching Eulalie with a pleasure he barely bothered to hide. She did not let him see any face she didn't choose. She eased 1 step to her left, so that Junia stood where the lamplight missed her cheek and showed only the good eye of her courage. She thought of the river again, old as sin and forgiveness both, and imagined its slow approval. A boy struck a wrong note on the fiddle and found it again. The dancers took a turn on the gallery boards, the wood making its old complaints. Mr. Kitteridge cleared his throat as if he were about to deliver a sermon and found the words not ready to be borne. He drank instead. Saul pounded the table with a cheer from a mouth that had never used the word please.
Eulalie stepped back toward the kitchen and let the door close on the swell of voices. In the quiet, the fire popped with the surprise of a small confession. She braced both hands on the table and counted backward from 10, not because she needed numbers, but because sometimes you must trick your body into believing it can return from the edge you have led it to. Junia slipped in beside her like a shadow keeping its promise. "We stand," Eulalie said. "We stand and we see." She did not say, "We run." She did not say, "We bury ourselves." She said the thing her own mother had told her when the night pressed too hard. "We see." They returned to the room in time to hear Mr. Ives apologize to no one. He set his napkin on the table with a firmness that suggested it had offended him. He stood, he did not quite sway. His wife touched his sleeve. He smiled at her with embarrassment that might have been gallantry in other lighting. He sat back down. His hand found the table's edge like a man finding a railing in a stairwell he'd used all his life. Eulalie watched, not the way a hawk watches, all hunger and air, but the way a midwife watches, the way you witness a new thing arriving and a person becoming the new thing's parent. Her face was not hope or fear. It was attention distilled to a point. Saul waved for more bourbon without taking his eyes off Pike, as if the overseer could deliver it from across the room by thinking obedient thoughts. Pike did not move right away. He looked at Junia, at the space between her hand and the table, and smiled. Eulalie let her glance brush him like the back of a hand brushes bracken on a path, neither greeting nor fear. Then she turned away as if he were not worth the rest of a second. The 7th plate waited, its rim shining in a way that made Eulalie think of the moon crossing a shoulder of water. 7 men, 7 moons. She had not asked why the number settled in her when it did. Perhaps it was the way the week arranges itself. Perhaps it was the way the river counts bends between towns. Perhaps it was the way Junia said, "We got 7 cypress panes in our window," as if the world had been divided into what could be seen through those squares and what could not. Maeve passed behind Mr. Kitteridge and set down a spoon with a small click that sounded like punctuation. Mr. Ives dabbed his brow and muttered an apology to the napkin. Mr. Beaufort tried in vain to pry open a joke from his mouth, and failing that, pried open his mouth and found only breath. Saul lifted his glass. Pike watched Eulalie with a hunger that would have called itself something else if it had owned a better dictionary. Junia's hand found her mother's. "Mama," she whispered. Not a question and not a plea, a joining. Eulalie squeezed once, a sailor's code for hold. And then the thing happened that would teach the room new definitions. Mr. Ives's chair skated an inch backward,
legs scraping the floorboards like a match being struck. He swallowed and heaved a breath that didn't land right. Mr. Beaufort stared at his own hand as if it had moved without his permission. Kitteridge found himself without a sentence. Saul smiled too broadly. Pike shifted his weight toward the center of the room as if the room were a stage and he the kind of man who loved lights. Eulalie stepped forward and gathered 2 empty plates, because that is what the room demanded a woman like her do. She let the room teach itself how quickly laughter turns to question. She let the men hear their own breathing. Mr. Ives put his hand to his throat in a gesture that wanted to be private and had been stolen by circumstance. He coughed once, twice, and the cough made no friends with relief. His wife half stood and said his name like it might return him to her. He waved her down with gallantry or habit, no one could tell which. He blinked as if the lights had multiplied. Saul looked at Pike, whose eyes had not left Eulalie. Pike tilted his head as if there were a joke he was waiting his turn to tell. Eulalie felt Junia's fingers go cold around hers and warmed them by not letting go. Somewhere, a fiddle remembered a hymn and slid into it without permission. In the kitchen, the fire worked without gossip. In the yard, a dog barked once, a sound that never managed to finish its thought. The neighbor women gathered themselves like thread in a needle. Maeve's hum turned syllabled, nonsense that felt like words, like rain in a language no one had set to paper. Eulalie thought of letters and the way they hid inside words like seeds hide inside apples, waiting to teach the eater what sweetness means when it grows a tree. Mr. Beaufort pushed back his chair with an apology to no one and stood, which turned the act of standing into a declaration. He touched the table, then the back of his chair, then nothing, as if moving through stations of a private cross. He sat again. His face did a slow mathematics and arrived at a sum that gave him no peace. Saul lifted his bourbon and found it heavier than his arm cared for. He looked at Eulalie then, not as a man looks at furniture, but as a man looks at a window he cannot open. She did not return the look. She arranged pastries that did not need arranging. Junia watched every move her mother made and practiced, not forgetting. The 7th plate still shone. The river in Eulalie's head made a new bend. She could feel the pull of it in her ankles, the way a person feels a storm before it thinks to announce itself with light. Pike set his glass down, the edge of it catching a small bright note from the lantern. He stood without offense and crossed the few feet to where Eulalie and Junia stood, his smile a weak imitation of manners. "Do you like my music?" he said to Junia, stepping a half-foot too close. "I picked the fellows myself." Junia did not step back, and she did not answer. Eulalie let her breath lengthen until Pike could not find its end. Mr. Ives coughed again. Mr. Beaufort pressed his palms to the table, a supplicant to wood. Mr. Kitteridge tried to stand and changed his mind without admitting he had one. Saul raised his voice the way men do when a room threatens to remember something he hopes it will forget. "Eat," he commanded, as if hunger and obedience were the same thing. The dog barked once more. The lantern hissed as a moth made a poor bet with its life. The music faltered and found footing. Junia lifted her chin another degree and looked not at Pike, but past him, at the 7th plate, at the line of the rim and the way the lamplight drew a white ring around it, as if the moon had volunteered to witness. Eulalie moved, not fast, river fast, the kind that looks slow until you try to stand still in it. She collected 2 empty glasses, traded one for a pitcher handle, pretended to disagree with a woman on the correct place for a spoon. Her hand hovered over the 7th plate and let the air make sense of itself. She withdrew her hand empty, which is not the same as harmless. The room took a breath. The room let it go.
Pike laughed under his breath the way a man laughs at a dog that isn't his. Eulalie did not permit him to name the sound she would make next. She looked at Junia, and the girl looked back, and in the small exchange a year passed, and they both lived it. Mr. Ives made a sound that did not belong at a festival. It wasn't large. It was the sound of a hinge in a house that will always be tilting. His wife said his name again, and the name sounded like it had never been tested in grief.
Saul set his glass down and finally looked away from Pike. The room did the arithmetic of wondering if something was wrong. Eulalie felt the river now in her ribs, a long pull toward a mouth that promised salt and clarity. She thought not of vengeance, but of weight, of the way a thing you have carried for so long begins to think it lives in you and not on you. She thought of setting it down. She thought of Junia's wrists. She turned toward the seventh plate again, and in the turning met Saul's eyes. They had nothing in them she wanted to keep. She let the look pass over her the way wind moves over a field that cannot leave. She lifted the plate and balanced it in one palm, steady as a prophet balancing a story. She took one step, then another. Behind her, Pike said her name in a tone that believed it owned vowels. She did not answer. In front of her, Mr. Beaufort closed his eyes for a blink that lasted too long to be a blink. Maeve's humming tightened to a wire. Junia's breath braided itself to Eulalie's, and together they made a rope. Saul reached for his glass, missed it, found it again, and drank as if the act could correct the narrative. He looked at Eulalie as if she might be a better mirror than the man beside him. She did not give him a face to claim. The seventh plate found the table. A quiet, like a hand laid on a shoulder, moved through the room. For all the noise, people hear a laying on when it comes. Saul lifted his fork. The river raised its chin. Junia's fingers tightened on her mother's. Maeve's hum pressed itself into a single thread of tone that might have been the string pulling an arrow. Somewhere in the yard, a nightbird called and didn't wait for an answer. Mr. Ives drew another breath that did not land where it ought. Mr. Beaufort steadied his mouth on a word he would not say aloud. Mr. Kitteridge tried to shape a jest and shaped instead a question. Pike watched Eulalie's hand as if it had a future he wanted to purchase. The fork reached the plate. The lamplight made the tines into small, polite spears. Junia's nails pressed crescents into Eulalie's skin, small moons telling time. The house sounded like a drum turned on its side, skin taut, waiting. Eulalie let her breath go so slowly it might have been a thought leaving the mind and finding the air where it would learn to be a fact. Saul's wrist turned, the fork lifted. The room performed its own casualness, pretending to be a place where nothing changed and no one learned anything they had not known at birth. The river, older than that pretense, pulled like a tide that only the bones felt. Eulalie felt it in the small, ache-brave places, ankle, wrist, the hinge of the jaw she kept steady for other people's comfort. She watched Saul's mouth open to the bite, and in the opening saw a road as clear as any she'd never been permitted to walk. Then the lantern nearest the mantel popped and guttered, pitching the room for a breath into a half-dark that made everyone their truer size. The fork hung a fraction in the air. Pike's hand twitched toward his belt in a habit he mistook for preparedness. Mr. Ives made a soft sound, an instrument remembering a note. Junia leaned into her mother. Eulalie whispered into the seam between the seconds, so small only a river could hear it. "We stand." The light steadied. Saul looked down at his plate, up at the room, then at Eulalie, whose face offered him nothing kindly meant. The fork moved again, inexorable as a clock's minute hand when you can have convinced yourself time is not a man with a whip. Eulalie did not ask the world for permission. She did not ask the past to become gentle. She tied herself to the thread of Junia's pulse and to the old song of the bayou and to the sound of Maeve's note pulled thin as courage, and she held her breath.
This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Breath back in a slow, narrow ribbon, as if the house itself had decided not to keep it. The fork hung over the seventh plate like a small moon on a bent nail. Heat from the candles pressed against her face. Junior's fingers were crescents, stubborn and human, digging into Eulalie's palm. She let the pain anchor her. The sound of a cork somewhere, the brittle applause of laughter trying to pretend it had not lost its rhythm. She took each noise and stacked it where it would not topple her. Saul's hand moved. The fork scraped a whisper across china. He brought the bite to his mouth, and Eulalie tasted metal in the air, the way you sometimes taste a storm before the light finds the ground. The lantern that had hissed near the mantel steadied into a quiet, obedient flame. No one, to Eulalie's eye, grew larger in the half-dark. No one shrank. People only settled into the size they had always been. She felt herself the measure of her own bones and found them enough. The first man to falter was not Saul. It was the neighbor with the neat hat brim, the one who kept dabbing at his brow as if weather could be wiped away. He coughed, quiet, then louder, with a surprised politeness, like a man who had stubbed his toe in church. His chair searched the floor for a steadier part of it. A tinny song of forks and knives drifted toward silence, one utensil at a time, like insects falling out of a summer cloud. Eulalie heard each sound with too much detail, as though the night had pressed a shell to her ear and told her to listen to the fine print. A napkin slipped, a throat cleared, a woman's bracelet chimed against the glass. She kept her gaze gentle, and nowhere in particular, the way you look at a deer that has not yet decided whether to flee. She did not count the men. She had already counted them. She did not memorize their faces. She had lived too long with their shapes in the doorway. Mr. Beaufort, she did not say his name inside herself. She would not keep him. Found the edge of his chair and stood halfway. A sound like an apology left him. He lowered himself. The music wobbled, bowed its head, and waited for either command or permission. Eulalie held still enough to hear the fire pop in the kitchen 2 rooms away, the one she banked with her own hands. She thought of the spoon she had laid across the mortar like a sleeping bone. She let the thought pass, a boat on a current. Overseer Pike laughed so low he might have believed no one could hear it. Eulalie did not give him her face. She shifted one step to shield Junior's narrow shoulder, to take any attention that might be hunting for a softer target. Junior stood like a doorway post, upright and ordinary, invisible in her effort, which was the kind of invisibility Eulalie had taught her to make when needed. Saul's hand moved. The fork scraped a whisper across china. He brought the bite to his mouth, and Eulalie tasted metal in the air, the way you sometimes taste a storm before the light finds the ground. The lantern that had hissed near the mantel steadied into a quiet, obedient flame. No one, to Eulalie's eye, grew larger in the half-dark. No one shrank. People only settled into the size they had always been. She felt herself the measure of her own bones and found them enough. The other hat man gentled his wife without meaning to be cruel. He pressed 2 fingers to his temple, and when he took them away, his face looked newer, younger, the way faces get when they are surprised by their own breath. He said nothing. Silence, thinner than silk and twice as dangerous, began to unspool across the room. "Fetch water," someone said to no one in particular. The word fetch bit the air the way a small dog bites a heel. Eulalie did not move. She had fetched all her life. Tonight she held. Pike took a step closer. His boots made that skidding sound men make when they want to remind floors that they own them. He said, "Kitchen girl," to Eulalie, tasting the words. "Stand straighter. Smile." Junior did neither. Eulalie let the corner of her body intercept the man's gaze. She put her tray on a sideboard and folded her hands, a posture that would read meek to anyone who needed it to. Inside her palms, the crescent indents of Junior's nails throbbed a little,
proof of a world that kept count differently than ledgers did. The neighbor in the hat, again Eulalie refused him a name, touched his throat as if a collar had tightened itself. He coughed softer now, careful not to put a stain on the moment. Mr. Kitteridge, the one who loved to sermonize with his fork, cleared his throat, found that his instrument had betrayed him, and elected to drink instead. Eulalie watched the tiniest fleck of light skate along the rim of his glass. It made a brief traveling star and died. Junior's breath shortened. A bird stuck behind shutters. Eulalie lowered her own breath, slow and steady, so the girls could lay itself down atop it and borrow that rhythm. She had taught her this too. In a house where no one would be allowed to rest, you learn to make resting places inside other people. A serving boy, Marcus, the borrowed one with the careful hands, stood at the edge of the room like a comma someone had misplaced. He looked toward Eulalie. She gave him nothing but the softest tilt of a chin that meant stay. He stayed. The shift came without fanfare, without any story the men could control. Mr. Beaufort, no, the man with the unnecessary ring, gripped the table and felt from it no wisdom. His chair scissored 2 inches. He blinked at the lamp as if it had moved. His shoulders widened briefly like a man preparing to sneeze, and then settled into a smaller truth. The wife beside him whispered a pet name into the air, and it did not return with the response it had always known to expect. "Water," someone said. "Where is the—" The sentence, like a bird startled from a fence, hopped twice and forgot where it meant to go. This was the moment Eulalie had asked the river for, one not made of noise, but of attention gathered tight. She felt it pull through the room like tide through reeds. She made that pull into a path and stepped onto it. She whispered, "Back," to Eulalie, not to retreat, but to bring the girl's body into a line with hers, 2 reeds bending the same way so wind could not separate them. The 7th plate had a sheen that seemed to make its own light. Eulalie did not look at it, and then she did, once, the way a midwife glances at the door and then forgets it. If help comes, it comes. If not, we already have what hands we need. She saw Saul's jaw notch. He lifted his fork, lowered it, found his glass instead. He swallowed. For a breath she saw his boyhood, a mean little boy in a clean shirt who had been praised for taking more than his share. The sight did not soften her. It merely made him smaller in her mind, a furnishing in a room she was learning how to rearrange.
A noise bucked out of the next table, the sound of a chair losing its balance and grabbing it back with a scrape. The hat man pressed a knuckle to his lips, a small surrender. The ringed one sighed with a weight that seemed too heavy to be housed in ribs. Mr. Kitteridge found no sermon at all, and Eulalie, within herself, placed a period. She turned. She wanted water without command, air without permission. In the kitchen, the hearth was a heart that loved her. It knew what weight she could lift, what iron she could set down, and it never asked for gratitude. She breathed a sensible breath of wood smoke, lard, spice, and the distant wet of the river muscling its way through weeds. Junior's hand did not leave hers, and that, too, was a sensible thing. What came next was the thing everybody on that property had expected every other day, the shout. It arrived from the gallery, where cool air and spectacle hold hands. "Saul!" a voice barked, and Eulalie could hear in it all the past shouts of boys who grow up convinced their names could be thrown like rope. Pike's boots answered the call out of habit. The men's voices did a rowboat's panic, everyone rowing, no one aiming toward an agreed-upon shore. Eulalie did not run. She set down the pitcher with care and took up another, as if nothing had changed. When she moved through the door, the room had made itself an audience to its own fear. The hat man coughed again with an extremity that embarrassed him. The ringed one focused far away, as if listening to an instrument he had left in another town. Saul's mouth had finally shut.
The sight of it felt briefly like a miracle, then like a wind's lie. Pike's eyes found Eulalie the way a dog finds the one person in the yard who does not wish to be noticed. "You," he said, "water, for the masters." Masters, a word that always wanted to be a mountain. Eulalie did not flinch at its height. She poured. She poured for the hat man who took the cup and did not immediately drink. She poured for the ringed one whose hands knew how to hold silver but not how to hold fear. She poured for Saul, who did not look at her, because to look at her would be to admit a world existed beyond his own reflection. Junior stood half behind her. "Breathe," Eulalie whispered, the word a thread drawn through cloth. She did not say, "Don't show them." She said the only thing worth saying. The hat man tried to stand proper and sat back with an expression that said standing had not consulted him. The ringed one shut his eyes. Saul pushed his glass away as if the table had offended him. A woman nearby murmured a prayer that sounded to Eulalie like a list of chores. Pikes watched Eulalie's hands. He had the look of a man trying to overhear a conversation conducted in a language he did not know. His jaw toyed with his lip. "You put anything in that?" he asked, and shaped his mouth around a smile that would not come. Eulalie lifted her gaze as if considering the question. "Cinnamon," she said, the truth that was too small to be helpful. "Clove." She did not list the other things in the room: impatience, arrogance, the weight of years. She handed Saul the cup and found that her hand did not shake, and because of that, Junior's did not either. The men made the noises men make when their bodies surprise them: the half-swallowed grunt, the O of inconvenience, the cough that hopes to be allowed to be private. One of them pushed his chair back, and it stayed pushed. One of them tried, and the chair argued. The music found some backbone and held a note that did not quite belong to the tune. The lantern by the mantel hissed with the industry of keeping light. Eulalie counted: not men, not bites, not minutes, breaths. Hers, Junior's, the fires. She broke them into even parcels and handed them out silently. Her mind tried to march forward into the afterward, into the search and the question and the naming. She kept it here by saying within herself the recipe for cornbread: meal, eggs, salt, milk, lard, the patient stir, the pan the color of a good night's sleep. She thought of the spatula that always seemed to know when to turn and when to wait. She let the rhythm of that small comfort fence her in. A glass broke. The brittle noise made the whole room blink. Pike's head snapped toward the sound the way a hound turns to leaf rustle. He had too much appetite in him to face mystery with anything except anger. He took 2 strides toward the table where the neighbor had knocked his drink, and then, remembering himself as a man who performed command for a living, turned them into 3 strides toward Saul. "Something's wrong," someone said finally, and the words loosened the thread on which the evening had been pretending to balance. Women's skirts whispered. Chairs scooted. The table watched it all with the blank patience of wood. "Back," Eulalie told Junior again, and this time she meant it as movement. They stepped to the kitchen doorway and let half of the room be framed by it, a painting that would not hang straight. From here, Eulalie could see the yard lamps throwing their honey onto faces she had memorized and faces she refused to keep. She could see the gallery boards, the flake of old paint oozing up at the nail heads, the place on the rail where someone's ring had scratched a worry into the grain. Pike's eyes found them again. "You stay," he said, because words were the only leash he had time to find. He turned to the men, put his hands out like a man organizing cattle. "Sit, gentlemen. It's heat. It's all this heat." The night breathed like a horse. Eulalie could smell lands beyond this one in the wind, rain from somewhere else, a cypress bog practicing its patience. The room tried to obey Pike out of habit. It failed out of truth. The hat man's breath hitched with impatience. The ringed one eased down into a smaller self. Saul's lips moved around nothing. Eulalie watched the 7th plate with the peripheral attention that refused to be worshipped. A sound at her elbow, Maeve's hum, now braided with words without syllables. Eulalie had not seen the woman come to the threshold. She didn't turn her head. She let the hum thread into her like a stitch and felt steadier where she had been thin. "Don't move," Pike said again, but he was talking to the room this time, to the panic he felt building under the floorboards like water. He touched Saul's shoulder the way a man touches an old dog he does not trust not to bite him. Breathe, he told him. He might as well have told the moon to stop affecting tides. When the first man slid from his chair to his knees, the sound his coat made on the floor was surprisingly sweet, a hush of cloth over pine. His hand caught the table but did not keep it. His wife said a small, careful word and folded herself to him, as if folding might correct the angle. Ululi felt no triumph. She felt a fact become a deeper fact. Someone shouted for a doctor. There was a doctor among them, but he was not the kind that believes kitchens hold knowledge. He ordered air, space, water, and received all three in clumsy portions. Ululi poured the plain comfort that had been requested. She did not pour too quickly. She knew the day would need its water later, too. Pike's stare scratched at her cheek. "What have you done?" he wanted his eyes to say. Ululi let her face be a field left fallow. Nothing to harvest, nothing to hurt. She knew Pike would search for a story that let him remain the hero. She knew he would want that story to be about kitchens and women, because that is where men like him deposit the shame they refuse to know is theirs. A woman fainted. The sound of it made several men stand as if gallantry might be a lightning rod against the kind of night this was turning into. The fiddler set his instrument down at last, as if admitting he should have done so earlier. The night sent a breeze through the gallery that smelled, to Ululi, of mud and iron and far-off rain. It put its hand on the candle flames and lowered them, just enough to make everyone look strange for a heartbeat. "Kitchen," Pike barked, pointing at Ululi as if she were a direction rather than a person. "Nobody leaves." Nobody leaves. The words rattled inside Ululi with the memory of a boyhood game played by children who believed rules could keep them safe. She drew Junia back into the kitchen, not in surrender, but in selection. The hearth wrapped them in heat. The knives on the table gleamed, small and private as thoughts. Marcus hovered, afraid of being in the wrong place and equally afraid of being found in the right one. Ululi set a basin under the pump and began to fill it. The pump handle creaked with the honesty of iron. "Time," she whispered to the girl. "Make time." Junia nodded. She knew the lesson. In a crisis, men want speed. Mothers build space around breath. They carried water back into the dining room. They set cups down where hands could find them, and took them away when hands forgot they had asked. Ululi's mind kept trying to count. She let it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She lost a thread and did not scold herself. Counting can steady a person. It can also become a net. She preferred rope. She saw in Saul's slackening mouth a kind of bewilderment that had never before been permitted to visit him. It did not dress him in anything that looked like innocence. It merely made him look briefly human. He took the water from her and did not thank her, which was the most honest thing he had done all evening. The hat man sagged. The ringed one's fine jacket did poorly against the angle the floor insisted on. The doctor shouted orders like a man punishing the air. Pike began to inventory who had eaten what, when, from whose hand. His eyes made a ledger of her, then of Maeve, then of Marcus, of each woman who worked in the kitchen. Ululi felt the ink of his gaze try to catch and refuse to be written down. A hand touched her sleeve. Maeve again, and this time Ululi let herself look full at the woman. She saw in her face the same stubborn place she knew in her own, the place that learns to keep water for later, the place that keeps songs even when the throat wants to give them away for free. Maeve's lips barely moved. She said, "River," in a breath that did not become sound. Ululi nodded once. The river is older than lights and orders. The river does not argue with the moon. It did not happen quickly. It did not happen slowly. It happened at the speed of a room learning it cannot pretend to be what it was a minute ago. Men loosened, voices frayed. All the while, Pike's suspicion turned its lantern back and forth across the kitchen door as if light could stitch the world into obedience. He began to ask questions and then almost immediately began to accuse. "You stirred the pots," he said to Eulalie, as if a kitchen could function otherwise. "Yes," she said. "You brought the plates." "Yes." "You were at the table." "Yes." Her voice did not apologize for what work is. "And you?" He looked at Junia not as a person, but as an incident. "You touched the cups." Junia swallowed once and did not look away. "Yes, sir." The "sir" was a hinge Eulalie had taught her to use when doors needed to swing without notice.
Pike's mouth pressed thin. His eyes did a hungry mathematics. "You?" He turned to Marcus and found a small mercy. The boy's face, a wet candle, told Pike he would get answers even if he did not know the questions. "What did you see?" Marcus looked at Eulalie. She glanced at the floor, at nothing, which was her permission to tell the truth that would do the least harm. "I seen Miss Eulalie cook," he said. "Same as always. And I seen Maeve from Arnaud carry to the far table. And I seen Overseer Pike drink from the master's glass when the fiddler played the wrong note." The room's head turned as if it were one body. Pike's face made a mistake and began to correct it. "You lie," he said, too quickly, and Eulalie felt a small instruction issue to the world. "Remember that spot. It might be useful later." She held still through the hour that followed, the hour that tried to become a trial before it had made the case that it was a night. Men were lifted, walked, fanned, argued over. Some coughed and quieted, some could not sit comfortably in their skin and went to the yard to be looked at by stars. The doctor did little but demand, and the women did what they have always done. They measured and brought and soothed and did not believe soothing a crime. Eulalie waited for the needle to swing from panic to blame. She could feel it testing its hinge. She walked ahead of it, not to outrun it, but to be somewhere useful when it arrived. She sent Marcus for more water and for a rag. She sent Maeve to the scullery to find the good bowls, which was a sentence that, by arrangement, also meant find the girl and make her breathe. She put her hand on Junia's back once, and once again, and that was enough to make the girl stand as if a tree had remembered it was a tree. The moment came like lightning silent in clouds. Pike's sick pride found footing. "Kitchen," he proclaimed, as if that word were a verdict. "Something from the kitchen. I'll have the lot of you whipped till you can't hold a spoon. He choked on the plan not because it was too big to swallow, but because a sound from the yard interrupted him. A wail high and surprised cut itself short. Someone had fallen. Two someones by the change in the only music that matters at midnight, the music of air leaving bodies. Pike paused. The doctor, red around the ears, pushed between people and knocked his shoulder into Eulalie without apology. Saul, pale with squeezing pride into a smaller and smaller container, tried to stand and sat again, his knees refusing their usual agreement. He looked at Eulalie now with hatred's blank cousin, puzzlement, and she learned that the face of a man who cannot make the world be what he ordered it to be is not the face of a god. It is the face of a child denied a toy. She did not witness each man's ending. The room curled in around itself, and people blocked sight the way trees block riverbanks. She witnessed enough to know that the night had accepted the weight she had asked it to carry. She also witnessed enough to know that the price would come due in the morning, and the morning does not make deals. "Junia," she said softly. "Now." They moved as if to fetch more water. It was not a lie. They would fetch the kind of water you keep inside your chest. Eulalie led her through the kitchen's other door, the one that opens onto the yard where wood is stacked, and men do not often come because wood is patient, and men prefer crowds. The night took them in like kin. The smell of cane, wet, sweet, faintly burnt, met them with an intimacy that would have made a less seasoned person cry. Eulalie did not cry.
She bent, quick and silent, and gathered a bundle she'd put beneath the split oak a day ago. A cloth with dried bread tucked into it, a tin with salt, a smaller tin with mended needles and 3 feet of thread, a stub of candle wrapped in waxed paper, and a paper folded small as a prayer. Junia's eyes widened, questions crowding, but the girl's mouth kept them until later. They set their feet on the path the kitchen girls used to take peelings to the pig troughs. No one would suspect that path of having important destinations. The troughs gleamed like parishioners under moonlight. Eulalie turned left there into the cypress shade that knitted itself tight. The bayou had sent tithes of fog into the low parts of the yard. The fog clung to their ankles like cool cats. Behind them, the house changed key. Voices sharpened. Someone shouted for lanterns in the fields. Someone else said dogs. Eulalie did not quicken and did not slow. "Breathe," she told the girl again, and Junia obeyed. "And listen." They listened, crickets scraping their small songs on their wings, a frog claiming a corner of night as if he could deed it to himself, the far-off clink of a chain at the mill house settling against its hook, footsteps where no one should be walking, and then, blessedly, footsteps exactly where men would be expected to run. Chaos had many feet, order had fewer, and they aimed it. Eulalie did not plan to be where order thought to step. The river path began as it always did, not on dirt, but in the body. Turn at the fig with the trunk like a woman's hip. Step into the gap where the cane leans but doesn't break. Touch the cypress knee that looks like a bent knuckle. Count 8 breaths, and then 5. The path only becomes path when the feet that love it walk there. Eulalie's feet had loved this way since before Junia was born. They came to the ditch where water remembered a deeper life. Eulalie eased Junia down the small bank and into mud that received them with a cool, rude kiss. "Hold," she said. "Let it take your weight without arguing." Junia did, and the mud acknowledged her by not swallowing more than her ankles. They moved along the ditch until it married the bayou, which is to say until stillness met current and both pretended to be the other. Fog gathered heavier here, as if the river had made a shawl and draped it over its shoulders for the evening. Eulalie paused, placed the bundle high under her arm, and reached for the cypress limb she knew would be there the way you know your own elbow. She tugged. The limb gave and brought with it a length of rope she had braided months ago and tied to the underwater root. She had told herself it was for hauling firewood nearer. The truth had always been larger. She handed the rope to Junia. "Hands," she said. "Find the knots." Junia found them and found that someone had tied those knots for fingers her size. Her breath hiccuped once, gratitude, fear, the shock of being seen by your own mother in a way that makes you larger, not safer. She slid into the bayou to her waist. Eulalie slid in after, the cold pulling a soft hiss from her. The rope let them step where the bottom did not want to be floor. The rope knew paths underwater that eyes could not see.
Dogs. The word arrived first in Eulalie's mind, then the sound behind it, the frantic punctuation of baying. The cry ricocheted off water and trees and made itself bigger. Junia's fingers tightened. Eulalie measured the distance by the way the hair on her forearms prickled. "They'll run the yards first," she said softly. "Then they'll try the north fence. We're not there." The rope carried them another 2 body lengths. A fish brushed Eulalie's leg and went about its business. She could not keep from glancing at Junia to see if the girl had made a story of it already. They came out of the water into the fringe of palmetto that bent under their weight and then tried to pretend it hadn't been used. Eulalie laid the bundle down, shook her arms small to shed water, and listened with her bones. "Downriver," she said. We'll take the island where the 3 cypress stand like sisters. Then we'll wait. Wait for what? Junior whispered. For the world to make its next mistake. They moved. The ground here knew how to be 2 things at once. Solid if you stepped soft, water if you stomped. Eulalie stepped soft. Junior watched and copied. Owls debated policy above them. Mosquitoes came like creditors and were paid no attention. When they reached the island, which was nothing more than a swell of dirt that refused to admit it was mud, the 3 cypress greeted them with the unsuspecting welcome of family. No questions, only shade. Eulalie laid the bundle down, shook her arms small to shed water, and listened with her bones. Downriver, she said. We'll take the island where the 3 cypress stand like sisters. Then we'll wait. Wait for what? Junior whispered. For the world to make its next mistake. When the lantern finally threw its light far enough to paint the palmetto in their direction, Eulalie's body made the choice before her mind. Water. They slid into it again, the rope true even in the dark, and let the current take some of the weight they were carrying. The dogs were clever enough to love their work and too simple to question it. They howled in triumph when the women's scent vanished into water. They always do. Men praised them and stood at water's edge like laws at the border of their own power. There, Pike said, as if a command could build a bridge from air. He sent men for a pirago. The boat they dragged looked stubborn about being helpful. 2 men climbed in and argued with their balance. Eulalie and Junior, tucked into the black mirror between cypress shadows, listened to the argument as if it were a nighttime story told by foolish uncles. The boat knocked the bank with the dull sound of a flat hand slapping a table. It pushed off. The men paddled toward nothing, the way men often do when they believe the river owes them directions. Eulalie chose not to move. The trick of water is not escape, it is patience disguised as movement. Let the men find frogs to startle and mosquitoes to curse. Let them call names into the night and believe names make people appear. The river's patience wore their noise down the way it wears down stone. The boat passed close enough for Eulalie to see the shadow of a face and not the face itself. Junior's hand again. Steady. Good girl. Good bone. Good future. They slept when the men grew bored, which is to say they closed their eyes for 2 breaths one at a time, and woke to make sure the world had not rearranged itself. The island held. The 3 cypress kept their sisterhood. The sky lightened by a color no one bothers to name because it's gone too quickly to need one. At that edged hour when birds clear their throats of night, Eulalie opened the paper she had kept folded small and memorized. It was a map with no lines. It was a list of hums. It was 7 circles and a cross. It was the names of plants she hadn't written because writing them would have made the knowledge into a trap if found. It was a sentence. Downriver 2 bends, then the old barge rope. She had written it in a hand that did not look like any hand she used in daylight. She could not make herself burn it. Not yet. Now, she said. And they moved. The bayou had a smell then, just before morning, that had always felt to Eulalie like generosity. Rot made into food, mud into cradle, mosquitoes into practice. She let it tell her where to step. She let it seal behind her the way water does when you do not insist on leaving a trail. They found the barge rope where memory promised it would be, a mossy length strung low between 2 trees like a forgotten instrument string. She tested it with her weight and found a friend. They waited, they balanced, and crossed into a stand of dwarf palmetto so dense that even light had to ask permission. On the far side, land made a small mercy of itself, dry, shaded, pitted with the hooves of things that do not file their names. By mid-morning, the shouts had thinned to occasional rumors traveling badly over water. Eulalie risked fire, small, whispered, more suggestion than flame. She warmed the bread in her bundle, and the warmth woke its courage. They ate without talking. The bread stuck a little to the roof of Junia's mouth, and she tipped her head back to dislodge it. Eulalie laughed silently, a sound that touches only the eyes. The girl laughed too, eyes bright, breath steadier than the night had any right to allow. "Where now?" Junia asked, licking a thumb and pressing the crumb seed to it so it would not waste itself. "Toward the place the boats don't go," Eulalie said. "Toward a friend who owes me no money and will ask me no price." "Who?" "A woman who used to be called Therese. She keeps a garden where the river pretends to be south, but is really just stubborn about being itself. She knows how to keep a plant alive when men have told it to die." "Like you," Junia said. And because praise can tilt a mother, Eulalie shook her head. "Like us," she corrected. They traveled by sense and by the letters that live in bark and shadow. Eulalie stopped once to press her palm flat to a cypress trunk and count the low ridges that spiraled around it. She had learned to make spirals stand in for time. Left-hand spirals meant hurry. Right hand meant caution. This one told her to hurry without haste. By afternoon, the cypress opened onto a slough with an old skiff pulled up under a live oak. The skiff knew Eulalie's hand. She had patched its leak 2 summers ago with pine pitch and stubbornness. She pushed it into water with a sound like a long sigh, and pulled with a rhythm that woke muscles she loved to trust. Junia sat in the bow and watched turtles drop off logs with the timing of embarrassed men.
They came to Therese's place the way one comes to a sentence you have known in your mouth from childhood and suddenly see written on a page, familiar and brand new at once. A lean-to with palmetto thatch, a patch of soil coaxed into sense with broken oyster shells and a border of old bottles that caught light in circles. A rope with drying fish teeth strung like strange prayer beads. Therese herself, hair threaded with gray, hands deep in a basin, water flashing up and licking her wrists. Her eyes found Eulalie and did not widen. That was her welcome. She dried her hands on her skirt and waited for Eulalie to choose the first word. Eulalie chose the smallest one. "Sister," she said. Therese nodded. She sent her gaze to Junia and let it rest there without pressing. "Child," she said, as if greeting a season, "you have your mother's knees." There was time now for a stiffer breath. Not much time, but enough for a woman to pour water into cups and set them down like a liturgy. Eulalie didn't tell the story, she told the edges of it. "Festival," she said. "Men full of themselves. Night that remembered how to be night." She did not say poison, she did not say 7. Therese did not ask for those words. Instead, she said, "You'll need drying. You'll need a place to make your body into a body again." She set a pot over coals and threw in a handful of something that smelled like a forest, pretending it had never let men in. "Tea," she said, "to tell your heart to speak in sentences again." Junia wandered the border of the garden without stepping into it. She read the world the way she had learned to read from her mother's hands. A label on a salt tin, a folding of paper, the newsprint that had taught Eulalie the names of ships and finds and men. She saw on Therese's bottles letters that weren't letters and tried them in her mouth anyway. Eulalie watched her and felt something rise in her chest that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with a door in a house you were told had none. They rested a little. They set their wet shoes near coals and watched steam write its small braille above them. Eulalie wiped mud from under her nails and found dirt that would not be removed because it had chosen her.
Therese's hands kept slowly moving, as if the day would stop if she allowed them stillness. "They'll come," she said, not as a threat and not as a warning, just as weather. "They'll make noise at first. Then they'll try to make silence. Then they'll make noise again. It will be a while before they remember they're only men." Eulalie nodded. "We will not be here when their remembering arrives." "You plan a road?" "A boat road," Eulalie said, "and a road through people." Therese smiled, a thing that looked like a held-back laugh. "That second one's the better road. Boats rot. People plant." She looked at Junia again. "Can you keep a thing in your head until it finds a better place?" "I can," Junia said, with a pride that did not show its shoulders too much. "Good," Therese said, "because I'm about to give your mother more names than paper can hold." She reached into the inner pocket of her skirt and brought out a bundle of twine. "Each knot," she said to Eulalie, "is a house. Some will feed you. Some will set the dogs on you if there's a man to watch them do it. The knots far apart are safest. The ones too close together are dangerous. The red thread," she held up a strand stained with crushed berries, "is the place you go if you've made a mistake bigger than your pride. The black, a thread rubbed with soot, is the place you go if you need to vanish without anyone to miss you." Eulalie took the twine. It weighed less than paper. It weighed more than a book. "I will not forget," she said. Night came again backward, light peeling itself from leaves, from water, from skin, until what was left were voices and the small lights people make because they are afraid of what they cannot own. Eulalie did not know if the plantation had counted its dead by then. She did not know if the doctor had found new words to scold the air with. She knew only that the river had not changed its course to please any man. That second night, pirogues passed somewhere farther off than a shout. Pike's voice did not ride them. He had chosen land. Dogs sang for saints who were not listening. Junia slept with her head on Eulalie's thigh. Therese kept the fire speaking low. Eulalie let her mind do a thing she had avoided. She let the faces in a line, not to keep them, to release them. She saw each man as a boy taught one lesson too many and another not at all. She saw herself not as their correction, but as the river's, older, disinterested, exact. When morning took off her shawl and showed her honest light, Therese brought out a bundle wrapped in sacking. "A dress that is not yours," she told Junia, "and a scarf. People see what clothes tell them to see. Today, they will be lazy about seeing." She handed Eulalie a hat with a brim like a woman who minds her own business. "Wear it like you were born in it." They left by water. The skiff took 3 breaths to remember them and then made itself a road. Therese walked the bank as far as the snagged log and raised her hand once. Eulalie did not look back a second time. She had learned that looking is sometimes a way of making yourself into a target. Downriver, the world grew stranger in honest ways. Trees that had drowned years ago and still insisted on giving birds a place to sit. Water that pretended to be land and fooled even turtles. A smell like rust and bread. They passed 2 fishermen who did not look up because looking up is a kind of testimony, and testimony requires court, and court requires a man who wants to run things. Eulalie thanked them in her mouth and kept the thanks. By the 3rd bend, they tied the skiff and walked on ground that complained less. Houses began to appear in the trees' gossip, lean-tos, cabins low and stubborn, a wash line that did not admit to belonging to anyone. Children's voices. This was not a town. A town suggests a mayor. This was kinship, insisting it could be enough.
A woman with hair the color of cold tea stepped out from behind a palmetto with a broom in her hand. She looked at Eulalie and Junia the way you judge the weather, with humility and accuracy. "You from Therese?" she said, not asking. Eulalie nodded. "Then you can come in without my dog telling you can't," the woman answered, and called into the trees without raising her voice. "More." People arrived out of foliage with the economy of deer. A man with a scar like a comma at the corner of his mouth. A girl with a baby on her hip who did not look old enough to have grown so competent. A boy holding a fish by the gill so it would not thrash dignity off his shirt. No one asked Eulalie to tell a story right away. In that, Eulalie understood she had found the right place. They fed them rice and beans and a piece of catfish that had been smoked until it believed itself safer than it was. Junia listened to the children's words, their notes and their inventions, and let her mouth learn them. Eulalie let her shoulders stop guarding her ears. It is a kind of work to let rest in. She did it with deliberation. Later, when the sun leaned toward generosity again, a figure came down the path in clothes that had not been sewn by any woman Eulalie knew. The coat seams were too neat, the hat the kind that protects a man's opinion of himself. Behind him 2 more men with rifles slung lazy. Pike did not bother to hide his teeth in his smile. Eulalie's body remembered the taste of the word dog. She did not stand. The woman with the broom did not raise it. The men stopped outside of Broom's reach. Pike let his eyes try to balance coin on each face and found no purchase. "This is stolen land," he said to the air, plaintive. "This is stolen people." No one answered. Eulalie knew the rule of men who expect obedience. They always have a second sentence waiting if the first one fails. He brought it out. "You think you can run to the mud and it'll make you free? The mud'll drown you." He looked straight at Eulalie. "You, come back. I'll argue for mercy." Mercy? He had used the word on her once when he reduced a whipping from 40 to 20. He had used it like a man uses a handkerchief, something to keep his lip from meeting the world too hard. Eulalie stood now because sitting made the shadow of him too long across her. She lifted her hat brim and let him see that her eyes were where she kept her work. "Go home, Mr. Pike. Your house is broken." He laughed, delighted by his own decision to be cruel. "You broke it. You fed men what I should feed you." He took a step. The rifles behind him lifted in the thoughtless echo of his movement. The woman with the broom shifted her weight slightly as if remembering a dance step. Eulalie did not glance at Junia. She did not glance at the men with rifles. She let the palm of her left hand rest against her thigh so the fingers would have something sensible to do. "Dogs didn't catch us," she said. "Water couldn't tell on us. The men at the oars don't know north in the dark." She gave him back his world, made of failures. She watched the knowledge fail to land in him. There was too much pride in the way, a clutter of trophies. "You'll come," he said finally, because the well of his words had been scraped to its iron bottom. "I'll take the child." He gestured, lazy and sure, toward Junia. Eulalie did not let the sound leave her she wanted to make. She kept it and put it where the other kept sounds live, a place near the small of her back that made her stand straighter instead of smaller. "No," she said, not loud, not swinging, a word like a door softly set closed. Pike shifted to make a show of lunging, and that was when the broom moved. The woman wielding it did not threaten, she swept. A cloud of powdered ash rose from the ground in a soft gray curtain that made Pike's horse, Eulalie hadn't seen the animal until then, hidden behind palmetto, rear and snort. The rifles lifted higher, then lowered, confused. The men coughed. Children laughed because children will when danger proves clumsy. The ash hung and then drifted toward the river like weather that had chosen a better town. Pike snarled and snapped a hand toward the rifles. "Fire!" No one fired. The men had been hired to look dangerous near roads, not to be dangerous near people who did not find their danger interesting. One man licked his lips like tasting his choice. The other looked at Pike's back as if he had discovered he could count the seams and did not like the sum. "You first," the Commissguard man from the village said, quiet and without performance. He held no rifle. He held a fishing spear that had more authority today than any law. Pike tried joy on his mouth and found it a stranger.
He said to Eulalie, his eyes returning to her because he needed a woman to punish to become the man he believed himself to be. "I'll mark you. I'll write your name down so deep the sheriff will read it in his sleep." Eulalie's mouth amended him before she could decide to be polite. "You cannot write me," she said. She lifted her chin just a little so that the shade of her hat did not hide her eyes. "I write me," she touched her breastbone, "and I read." The sentence hit him wrong, too complicated for the place he kept his pride. He scoffed. "You can't read anything that matters." She thought of the newsprint she had flattened by hearthlight. She thought of the inventory sheets she had read upside down while Saul's clerk licked his pencil. She thought of the river's language and the knots of Phares' twine and the way Junia's breath, when steady, could guide a boat by sound alone. "I read the afternoon," she said, "and it says you will not be here." It was too poetic for him. He scoffed and yanked his horse. The animal obeyed reluctantly. The rifles hesitated and became men again, the way dangerous tools become harmless once they are laid down wrong. Pike left them and rode toward the part of the world that still listened when he shouted. The village unclenched its shoulders. The broom went back to being a broom. Junia exhaled all the way into her shoes and looked at her mother to see if laughter was safe. Eulalie gave her a very small smile and felt it live in her face like a candle sheltered by two hands. Days stitched themselves together after that with rough, comforting thread. Eulalie worked in Therese's garden in the mornings and in the afternoons at a table where nothing hurt to set your elbows on it. She mended nets with a precision that had first been taught by pie crusts. She wrote, when paper could be found, the names of women and men and children as if placing their names on a raft. Maeve, Marcus, the broom woman who turned out to be named Luce, the comma-scarred man who turned out to be named Baptiste too, no kin and kin anyway. Word came down river wrapped in rumor the way fish comes wrapped in newspaper. 7. Eulalie did not hold the number in her teeth like a trophy. She set it on the table between herself and Therese and looked at it until it became a thing that belonged to both of them and neither. 7, Therese said, with the same voice she used to count seedlings when they broke ground. And the house. Broken, Eulalie answered, which is another word for truth. The sheriff? Busy counting, busy pretending he knew how to count before today. Eulalie had heard from a riverman with a wicker hat that deputized men had ridden out twice and returned twice with mosquitoes for medals. She did not believe this made them harmless, it only made them late. It could not last as only one thing, nothing does. The village began to fill beyond what it could hide. Word of a place makes more place and also more eyes. Eulalie watched more boats on the water than she liked. She watched a new kind of listening on Junia's face, the listening a girl does before her voice lowers into the steadiness of a woman's. She watched Therese wrap cuttings and names into the same bundle. She watched Luce teach the children how to lie in ways that save lives and not in ways that ruin them. One evening, as the light climbed the leaves from the bottom and jumped off the top, a shape bent the palmetto. A man, alone, hat in his hand. He walked without the performance of law. He looked like a person who had had to put his pride in a jar and screw the lid down only halfway. "Baptiste," he called, and several heads turned, which was proof of the only kinship that matters. Eulalie stood. "Here," she said, and he came no closer than she would have, which told her something comforting about him. "I bring this," he said, and held out a folded paper. "From a woman named Maeve. He seemed to know the name had weight here and handled it like an egg. She told me to tell you, the bowls are washed, the stove is clean, the door is open to the wind, and she said to tell you Marcus is safe. He got himself hired at the mill where the owner drinks enough to forget faces." Eulalie felt her lungs do that unpracticed thing, take air without fearing its price. She took the paper and did not open it yet. "And Pike?" she asked. The man shrugged, a tired gesture that never becomes elegant no matter who does it. "Mean and sore. He goes around the way men do when they have lost an audience. He wants the sheriff to be his echo. The sheriff wants to write a thing that makes him look like he was in the right place at the right time, and a story like that is hard to find. The men who did not die think their stomachs were insulted and want revenge. They will settle for talk until the name comes cheap." Eulalie nodded. "Then we will not be cheap." He smiled, a real smile that apologized for being small. "I'll take a message back?" "Yes," she said. "Tell Maeve we broke the plates on the way out so no one could ask them to tell tales. Tell her I will send a string with knots when the moon is less nosy. Tell her we will need 2 good bowls again soon,
and tell Marcus I owe him a piece of good bread and a whole afternoon without anyone calling his name." The man left. Eulalie unfolded Maeve's paper. It was a sketch, like the one she had sent, but the circles today were fishing weirs drawn as moons and their lattice as constellations. In the corner an X where a priest sometimes rode to look away from his vows a while. Eulalie read it as easily as she read recipes the day after she had invented them. "Time," she said to Thérèse. "Time," Thérèse replied. They did not leave the village so much as let it leave them. People were routes as much as places. Eulalie carried the string of knots, Junia carried a book someone had pressed into her hand, an arithmetic primer with half the pages missing. "Keep it," the giver had said, "so your numbers won't be mean to you." They went up a bayou and down another, past a tree where a man had carved the year before deciding not to die, past a deadfall that made the river play a tune on itself. Where they went is not for telling. The roads through people are not for men who write ledgers.